Our speaker today is Steve Sherman, who is president of Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. Steve and his wife, Wick, have traveled here today to be with us from Houston, Texas. Steve served with the Special Forces during the Vietnam War, and he has an MBA from Harvard University. The Vietnam Veterans for Factual History is an organization of individuals devoted to providing factual information about the Vietnam War, as shown on their website, vvfh.org. And interestingly, longtime AVVBA member Kerry King was one of the original members of the VVFH. Steve has participated in many symposiums about the war, and he's made many presentations at the annual Texas Tech Vietnam War conferences, and probably has more connections than anyone about the war. I can give you one example. When we were working to get the film shown on Alabama Public Television, the general manager there wanted to interview 6 or 8 Vietnam War veterans from Alabama. Well, of course, we don't know any Alabama veterans, so we contacted Steve. That day he came up with a list, and we talked to several of them. Within 2 days, had 7 or 8 available, including a retired Army Major General who had a very distinguished career in the legal world. He's a past president of the Alabama State Bar Association, is a member of the University of Alabama School of Law Hall of Fame, and was nominated and I think received the Distinguished Alumni Award for the U.S. Army War College. That's an example of the caliber of people he knows. Steve's been involved with the AVVBA for many years, including his recommending the Emmy Award-winning David Naglieri to produce our documentary, a film about the war, and arranging for his organization to review our film script for factual accuracy. And by the way, a film that now has almost 1 million views on YouTube, been shown at least 156 times on over 80 television stations throughout the country, and featured by many prominent organizations, including the VFW, the American Legion, the West Point Alumni Association, is now shown to the military history classes and ROTC programs at many prominent universities, and was previously featured during a live Fox News television interview with Pete Hegseth, who is now Secretary of War. The Vietnam Veterans for Factual History is one of our partners, with their logo shown on the AVVBA website. You may recall that VVBAH Executive Secretary R.J. Del Vecchio was previously our monthly luncheon speaker in February 2018. That was pre-COVID, with about 170 in attendance, and he later served as the moderator during the November 2019 Vietnam War Symposium that we had at the Atlanta History Center, with capacity attendance of 400 that included Steve, and many of his members came from all over the country. One guy even came from Australia. Please welcome Steve Sherman.
All right. Good. Thank you for inviting me here today. The purpose of my being here is to discuss a project that I've been thinking about, as many of you have, for just about 60 years. For the last 30 years, I've been spending full time researching. And I finally accomplished my project with the assistance of 2 co-editors, including Roger Soiset from your organization here, and about 30 plus co-authors. And that is this book here that I'll be talking about today. But before we start on that, I'll give you some background on myself, which might be more than you need, but useful to put the rest of my talk into context. When I arrived in Vietnam in 1967, August 1967, like every other lieutenant, I came prepared to win the war single-handedly. But I found myself a REMF with 5th Special Forces Group in Pleiku as the S5, the PSYOPS officer, and later the S5 officer, and even later in the Trang as the Group S5 Plans officer. A year later, my service obligation ended. I went back to Massachusetts, and I spent enough time there to know, after having watched the Chicago Convention and the election process in 1968 from Massachusetts, that I preferred Vietnam. So I bought an airplane ticket, and on January 1st, I was on the beach in Hawaii watching the fireworks for New Year's. After some months waiting for the big think tank contractors to recognize my full potential, I wandered into the PX looking for a legal way to buy my cigarettes, and I came out with a job as the Vietnam Regional Exchange Plans and Programs Officer. I was in charge of phasing out a $400 million retail operation, which I managed to close my job out in 2 years. I went home and got my master's degree, and then went back to Southeast Asia, not to Vietnam this time, but to Singapore, to be an entrepreneur. I wasn't particularly successful there, building cement boats, chartering tugs and barges, managing an international airline, and marketing a board game. I came back in 1979, where I actually drew a paycheck from a big 8 accounting firm in Houston, Texas. I realized that wearing a suit in Houston weather was not fun, so I became what one of my business school associates called the Studebaker dealer of the computer industry. I leased antique word processing systems for 10 years after the manufacturer had basically abandoned them. And to this day, I have a soft spot in my heart for monopolies in certain enterprises. As the computers died off, I became more and more involved with Special Forces history. And finally, when Clinton was elected, I decided to return to the 60s, mentally, if not physically. And I spent full time on Vietnam history projects ever since. In 1996, I discovered the Texas Tech annual Vietnam seminars and have since become a regular presenter. Okay. In 2004, I held my own conference, the most expensive party I ever threw. And from the nucleus of attendees at that conference, we formed VVFH, though that didn't take place for several years. Next slide. The VVFH has an extensive website with lots of good information, including your AVVBA video. VVFH has published numerous books, including a series called The Indochina War and the Year of, providing an annual collection of essays for the years 1963 to 1976. We've published 6 of 8 VVFH magazines, including a comic book, which people now call a graphic novel, surprise to me. And they're available as a free download, thanks to patrons who buy the full-color physical copies of the magazines to offset our costs. Next slide. Besides our association with such knowledgeable and experienced persons as our co-authors, there's another factor that gives us an edge over other students of the Vietnam War. For years, we've searched out and transcribed primary source material, many of which have been undiscovered by other researchers. Our transcriptions included formatting them to be word searchable across all the volumes. You can see how many volumes are involved in each of the series. Quite a lot. We're probably well over 100 books right now. In getting into such a wide range of material, we've come across facts that seem to have had very little notice in recent histories. One such fact is that a famine killed 1 million people in North Vietnam in 1944. Not many people know about that, because the Japanese were taking all the rice out of Vietnam to bring back to Japan. 1945, they couldn't ship it out anymore because we were blocking the sea lanes, and they allowed the Vietnamese to export some rice from the south to the north, and the famine ended. Obviously, the Red River Valley was not productive enough to sustain the population that lived there. Not if 1 million people died. Did this event enter into the minds of the Communist Party and be one of the reasons for their intransigence and not being willing to take any agreements to settle the war properly? In 1954, after the partition, North Vietnam continued to import rice from the south. But soon, they closed that border and embarked on an unsuccessful and murderous land reform campaign. Was the North reluctant to rely on the South for its food? That's just a thought. Another project we've undertaken is to improve access to the USAHEC, the Army War College at Carlisle library, with over 400,000 rarely seen files. Our plans for this project use heavy use of AI and will be a subject for further discussion at another date. And now we come to the point of our presentation. This year we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the fall of Phnom Penh and Saigon by publishing our book, A Factual History of the Vietnam War and its Aftermath, a reappraisal after 50 plus years. More than 30 plus authors participated in the effort, which was to collect our combined knowledge into an authoritative history of the war. To date, that history has been misreported by the media, misrecorded by the historians, mistaught in our schools, and misapplied in addressing policy decisions. We start out our book by identifying our use of the term Vietnam War as a shorthand for the conflict that enveloped the former French Indochina, as well as Thailand, for most of the 20th century. While our members tend to call it the Second Indochina War, a plethora of other names confuse the boundaries, if any, of the subjects of our interest. This war had deep roots in the cultures of the region going back at least 2 millennia, not merely decades. When it arrived in its present form, it was focused on the Communist Party in North Vietnam and its willingness to proselytize for Chinese and Russian leadership endeavoring to spread the communist powers. We mentioned terms such as counterfactual history and unwinnable war, and by doing so received the criticism of being anti-academic. Yeah. One of our academic reviewers commented that the majority of contributors to this volume challenged the orthodox academic interpretations of the war and embraced forms of revisionism. He elaborated by saying it's typically considered orthodox to dismiss American intervention as ill-advised, immoral, and from the outset doomed in regard to most of the Vietnamese who opposed a communist takeover of Vietnam being corrupt, incompetent, ineffectual, and to present the Vietnamese Communist Party as embodying the general will of the Vietnamese people. Revisionists, on the other hand, typically believe that a relatively free and prosperous anti-communist South Vietnam was, in the context of the Cold War, a goal for which it was worth Americans fighting and dying, one that was actively pursued by large numbers of intelligent, brave, and patriotic Vietnamese, and which was not, therefore, inherently unattainable. That may have been a differentiation that could be debated on a college campus 50-plus years ago. But in the 50 years that have elapsed since the fall of Saigon, and the plethora of documentation showing Hanoi's complete control of its southern surrogates, and the actual results of that regime's policies, tends to make the orthodox viewpoint rather untenable. The Hanoi-based communist regime was repressive and brutal, and after victory in April 1975, liquidated tens of thousands of its domestic enemies, just as it had done in 1954. They imprisoned hundreds of thousands more in brutal conditions, some of them for many, many years, wrecked the economy, precipitated the virtual starvation of much of the population, and generated one of the worst refugee crises since the Second World War. Any degree in liberalization of the Vietnamese Communist Party only began seriously after 1986, after bloody confrontation with Communist China, and soon the ultimate disintegration of the Soviet Union. Hanoi's control of Laos destroyed any semblance of freedom for the Lao people, and the monstrous Cambodian communists, the Khmer Rouge, killed off nearly a third of its own population before it became so repulsive that Hanoi had to destroy its own creation. The new levels of corruption in the DRV far exceed the peculations of the GVN, while the bulk of Vietnamese Americans today demonstrate a higher level of commitment to democratic government than many of our own longer-term residents. We spend a fair amount of time in our book, some have said far too much, at the beginning of our book, in discussing the historical hegemonies in the region. From Funan or Chen La, Angkor, later to Cambodia, to Lan Sang, Laos, to Lan Na, Sukhothai, and Siam, to the Tangu Empire of Burma, all conquered, depopulating the areas they conquered and flourishing for a time, while the Vietnamese, not quietly or not so quietly, out-reproduced them in its drive south to become the ultimate hegemon in the region in our time. We debunked the myths of a millennia of Vietnamese successful efforts to maintain its independence, pointing out that almost every so-called invasion from outsiders resulted from an invitation from one party or another in the querulous Vietnamese society. The Chinese and later the French came into Vietnam in response to requests for assistance from the contending royal factions. Just as later North Vietnam asked the Russians and Chinese for assistance against the French, and the South Vietnamese asked the United States for help against the North Vietnamese. We discuss Ho Chi Minh, a dedicated Leninist who oversaw Vietnam's role in the Cold War, the First Indochina War, and the resultant Geneva Accords. On that subject, we accept and go beyond the fact that the U.S. and South Vietnam were not signatories to so-called accords, which are never adopted by a formal vote. It mandated that the Vietnamese could choose where they wished to live, which is hardly practical if a reunion was to come about in 700 days. Also, the North Vietnamese closed its border at the 17th parallel, which was a de facto indication of a boundary. J.P. Honey quoted the head of the Viet Minh delegation as saying, "You know as well as I do that there won't be any elections." Then we get into that war that we're all familiar with, beginning with Averell Harriman's disastrous neutrality agreement on Laos. Its repercussions, including the ultimate assassination of South Vietnamese President Ngo Dinh Diem. We continue with the revolving door governments in Saigon, the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, the introduction of bombing in the north, and the involvement of American troops in the south. Throughout the book, in those black bracketed boxes you see there, we throw in vignettes of the personal experiences of Allied participants, both American and South Vietnamese. We talk about the rise of the so-called anti-war movement, its sources and flaws in American strategies to conduct the war, Khe Sanh, the Tet Offensive, the Battle for Cam Duc, the Phoenix Program, the air war, Laos, all get our attention, as do aspects of winning hearts and minds, atrocities, herbicides, and policies of Johnson and Nixon. Slide. We cover the Cambodian incursion, Lam Son 719, the Easter Offensive, and the Paris peace talks. Finally, we talk about the end of the war in Paris, Washington, Phnom Penh, and Saigon, and wind up with a discussion of the aftermath in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, and the United States. Our perspective is naturally a Western perspective. We are not here to offer propaganda for those who had so little regard for their own people that they sacrificed so many to establish an ideological-based rice bowl. Slide. While this book presents aspects of history, the history it reports on in various depths of knowledge and the quality of analysis presented by all the different authors that we have, it also demonstrates a degree of internal consistency, which we welcome in our final article. The major thrust of this book is to demonstrate how this war ended 50 years ago wields its influence on almost everything that happens in our society today. America celebrates World War II as a victory over an evil ideology, an end to decades-long depression, the rise of education and prosperity in a newly emergent middle class, a unified society that was preparing to remove the one final barrier, and the emergence of the United States as a superpower that saw its mission to do good in the world for friends and foes alike. On the other hand, that things from World War II sort of lasted about 30 years. On the other hand, the Vietnam War turned the United States into a paper tiger on the international scene, a polarized society that uses social imperfections as a club to wield for political gain, and suffering from serious defects in academia, public media, and public morality. Failure to understand the true events of the war has led us into decades of forever wars and misinformed decision-making. By ignoring the true history of that war, we are, as the saying goes, condemned to repeat our failures. Slide. The final section of the book deals with the aftermath and the impact today. We present a series of articles by identified authors covering those subjects listed above and more. We show why and how much the Vietnam War matters today. Throughout our book, as previously noted, there are variations in the contributions of multiple authors. We accept that. This book could not have been written by a single narrator without injecting an unacceptable level of bias. We conclude the book with a carefully negotiated essay by two of its editors on that specific subject. Now we're faced with the challenge of promoting this book and making our views known on a wider scale. Unfortunately, I have a dismal record in my marketing efforts. Today's discussion is probably the first time I've made a major effort to promote our books. Usually I'm more interested in getting on to the next one rather than marketing the last one. The participants in this book didn't do so for fame or fortune. Short of a free book or two, they received no contributions, but they were aware of and supportive of the continuing efforts of VVFH to promote our history. Besides buying our book, our material, and passing on a good word, if you want to be supportive of our projects, one of the most important concerns today is declassification. If the U.S. was to put every one of its government employees to work today declassifying documents, the project would never, ever be completed. There's very little, if anything, about the Vietnam War that needs to be classified after 50 years. But most classified documents don't have automatic downgrading instructions. What is needed is an executive order directing rapid automatic declassification. There's no reason to keep on making the same mistakes because of an incorrect view of history. So if you got any change to pull, there's only one person that can make an executive order to do that. The authors of the various command histories that we've been working on said similarly about their work in one form or another. The purpose of their history is to serve as an authoritative source for future research and reference purposes. If this is so, then the continued classification defeats the purpose for which the documents were created. Surely we must do something to set the matters right. Our factual history is available on Amazon. If you buy for $35 on Amazon, if you buy the limited copies we have brought with us today at $30, you'll save postage, tax, and travel time and a few dollars on the cost. We also have another special offer available. Slide. One more slide. We have a 3-book offer. Our factual history, a collection of end-of-tour reports, which is over 500 pages, from general officers serving in Cambodia, which provides unique insights into the events of that troubled time. And the SyncPack Appendix 4 to the 1975 command history, covering Operation Frequent Wind, the evacuation of Saigon. That has 250 pages about the evacuation. Incredible stuff. I didn't know there was 250 pages to talk about, but there was. The evacuation of nuclear materials from the lot, for one thing. All 3 of the books, if you get it from our stock in hand, will cost you $90. If they run out, then you can have them for $100, and we'll mail them to you by priority mail. All right. One more thing. Well, I was living in Singapore with my wife, who's here in the audience. We've been married for 53 years now. I never heard or saw the statement from James Schlesinger, who was then Secretary of Defense, until I came across it this year. If anybody in the audience has seen this statement, I'd appreciate it if you'd let me know. But I thought it was a very important statement to be made, and I never saw it before. I'm not going to read it all to you because we have to get on to a Q&A, really. So I thank you for your attention in this talk, and I will respond to questions, and there are copies of the book that are available in the back. Oh, one other thing about the book itself. One of the most important historians on Vietnam today in the United States is a woman called Lien Hong Thi Nguyen, Vietnamese American. And she dedicates her book to her parents, who came to the United States, worked very hard to send their children to school, get a good education, including her. But they never talked about the Vietnam War to their children. That's not something limited to the Vietnamese community. We all know that. She subtitles her book, Hanoi's War for Peace. That's the problem with not having a father that talks to you about the war. And she is probably going to be for the next couple of decades, the most important authority on Vietnam in the academic theme. One thing I think about our book is that it's readable by anybody. Share it with your children, your grandchildren, talk about it, use it as a prop to help you talk about it to those same people that you don't talk about now. Let me open it up for questions. Yes?
Yeah, I got two questions. One of them, in 1970, when we went into Cambodia, and General Abrams was there, and he said this was an incomparable opportunity to win the Vietnam War. When he saw that they were fleeing, fleeing from the sanctuary areas into the thing, and for some reason he didn't execute it, okay? As General Abrams said, and it's in the book, there's several books out. One's called The Bitter War, you're probably familiar with. And basically General Abrams said this is an incomparable opportunity to win the war because they were fleeing from the sanctuary areas, okay? We had a 30-kilometer restriction, 60-kilometer restriction. Nixon said, go get them, okay? So there was a period there in the summer of 1970 to win the military war. Yeah, the second one was Kissinger kind of lost the political war, and you mentioned that up there, right?
Quite a bit.
Because he agreed to let the North Vietnamese have their forces in South Vietnam. Never told Nixon, never told Ellsworth Bunker, okay? None of them knew that, okay? Okay,
And
good.
Steve Young wrote a very good book on Kissinger and his duplicity. Steve Young wrote a very good book about Kissinger and his duplicity. Steve is one of our authors here and also just a quite important source of information. In Cambodia, I have a personal theory which I do state in the book and qualify it, but I've talked to people who served in Cambodia in various periods of time from 63 on up to 75. And they say Lon Nol wouldn't take a dump, without Sihanouk's permission. To my thinking, there was no way that Lon Nol overthrew Sihanouk. Sihanouk said, I'm going to go take the cure in Paris. You're going to take over the government. You're going to invite the Americans in to do whatever they want to get rid of all the communists in my country. And then I'll come back and take over the country. He did that with the French. That was a tactic. Lon Nol did what he was told. The evidence for that situation being such is that a person I know, a Cambodian, who served with the Khmer Sarai and went to Cambodia in 1969 for his boss, to talk to Lon Nol, to basically make sure that the Khmer Sarai wouldn't stab them in the back. Lon Nol finally got around to inviting the Americans to come in. The Americans didn't know what they were going to do. They said, "You got any plans?" And they asked General Abrams. He said, well, we had plans to go across the border and capture a few supply dumps. But Congress got in the act and said 60 days, 40 clicks or whatever it was. And we had the capability of just sweeping through Cambodia and taking all the communists out of Cambodia. We cut off the port from Sihanouk, which made the Ho Chi Minh Trail more important. We cut off the rice for the North Vietnamese in Cambodia. What we didn't do was get rid of the Vietnamese in Cambodia. And by the time the people of Cambodia demonstrated their disdain from the Communist Party, for the Vietnamese, in their usual way, which is killing people and throwing them in the Mekong River and sending them back to Vietnam, they were attacking Sihanouk's wife, and who was Vietnamese, and there was really no way that Sihanouk could deal with that problem. But we didn't do that right, but the people who complain about what we did, the college campuses, Kent State, Jackson State, that protested so loudly that we did not go further, those are some people who should look at what they did do, what they did accomplish in terms of the millions of Cambodians that were slaughtered by their own Communist Party in Cambodia. The anti-war movement has been asking in recent years to be given recognition for their efforts to end the war. I'm perfectly willing to give them recognition for their efforts to end the war. They certainly influenced Congress. But if they take that recognition, they also take responsibility for what happened in the end by the ending the war in the way it did. And that was really bad. More people were killed in the 10 years following the Vietnam War than been killed in the 20 years of actual war. More questions? No? Huh?
You know about Kulong 1, 2, and 3?
Hang on, please.
Okay. You know, the operations into Cambodia, first thing was we had to go up the Mekong River because all the South Vietnamese that lived in Phnom Penh were going to be killed by the Khmer, right? So we went up there. In fact, we airlifted the whole 9th Army Division out of South Vietnam up the Mekong River. And that was to free the 20 million or whatever it was, 1,000 people that lived in Phnom Penh. So there was opportunities to do that. And like I said, General Abrams said, when he saw that they were fleeing from the borders, he said, this is an incomparable opportunity to win the war. But I think with Melvin Laird and the people back in Washington, they didn't want to go into Cambodia. No. And so that's why that was stopped. But it could have been won at that time.
The other book they are offering there is 4 end-of-tour reports from Cambodian officers, 3 of them who served after 1971. And one of my friends, who I quoted in the book, I believe, said, we were there as a military equipment delivery team. We could give them guns, we could give them whatever equipment they needed. We couldn't teach them how to use the gun, we couldn't teach them how to load the gun, we couldn't even tell them which direction to point the gun. So it's really a fascinating history of I won't say incompetence, because the people who were doing it were quite competent, but just cutting our own tail. So.
Could I make just a statement about the book on Operation Frequent Wind that's back there? Yeah. Most of y'all probably know that the one of the honchos of that operation was our own Major General Livingston, who earned the Medal of Honor as a Marine captain, but he was one of the leaders in the Operation Frequent Wind thing. And every now and again, you know, he's over here, but he does read our emails and stuff. So just thought I'd throw that in.
Any other questions? Well, Steve, then on behalf of the AVVBA, first let me thank you. I think as we've all progressed past our 20s, we recognize that history is in fact a wonderful teacher, but it has to be recorded properly and accurately. And that's what you've done and what you continue to do, and that's very, very important for us. The other thing that you may not know is you are looking at a room full of short story authors. And one of the things that AVVBA has done, aside from our wonderful Truths in this video, is I'm Ready to Talk. There are 3 volumes of it, and on behalf of AVVBA, first, thank you very much for talking. As a team of authors to another author, it's a pleasure. And our AVVBA challenge coin on our behalf. Thank you so much.